Надо сказать правду, что сначала ему было несколько трудно привыкнуть к таким ограничениям, но потом как-то привыклось и пошло на лад. Даже он совершенно приучился голодать по вечерам. Но зато он питался духовно, нося в мыслях своих вечную идею будущей шинели. С этих пор как будто самое существование его сделалось как-то полнее, как будто бы он женился, как будто какой-то другой человек присутствовал с ним, как будто он был не один, а какая-то приятная подруга жизни согласилась с ним проходить вместе жизненную дорогу. И подруга эта была никто другая, как та же шинель на толстой вате, на крепкой подкладке без износу. Он сделался как-то живее, даже тверже характером, как человек, который уже определил и поставил себе цель.
Texting.
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 Texting. Texting. Texting. Texting.
Texting.
Texting.
Mark, Will, and Tomek present
Texting.
And welcome to another episode of Texting. This is episode 6, and I'm Tomek in Moscow.
And I'm Mark Will in Taipei.
Okay.
Hope I sound excited enough.
Okay. So, today the topic is a very well-known short story by the Russian writer Nikolai Gogol. That's the Ukrainian pronunciation. Or Gogol, as he's known here in Russia. The Overcoat. And we'll be using the Andrew McAndrew. Whoa, that's kind of weird. I just noticed that, speaking of the whole, like, Akakievich, now we've got the Andrew
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was thinking
That's
of.
weird. Okay, so...
I want to say something about Mr. McAndrew before we start.
Okay.
I don't know that his translation of the Overcoat is the best one available. That's the one we found online, so that's the one we're reading. But Mr. McAndrew translated the first edition of Dostoevsky that I ever owned. And in fact, I've got that paperback with me to this day. I probably got it when I was 17 years old. And it's a paperback signet classic featuring Notes from Underground, White Nights, The Dream of a Ridiculous Man, and selections from The House of the Dead. And I've read this from cover to cover many times. And this was probably my introduction to Russian literature and translation. So even though he may not be the best translator, he has a special place in my heart because he translated these short works of Dostoevsky.
Nice. And we have no reason to assume this translation is bad. We know that Nabokov is very sensitive about translation, which we'll get into later. But I think we basically chose it, one, because we found the PDF online, and two, because it is more contemporaneous than the Constance Garrett version, which is like the one that's in the public domain. So, yeah, I think we were justified.
Constance Garnett, right?
Yes, sorry. Yeah. He's like the founder, right? Of
she, right?
Oh, is it? This is my gender bias that I just assumed it was a man.
Yeah, I think Constance is a female, but I could be wrong.
Well, fair play to her. Either way, I mean, she is a pioneer, even if her translations could use some updating.
Well, I think I read her translation of Crime and Punishment, maybe, and possibly also the first translation of the Brothers Karamazov that I read. But anyway,
I mean, if we are gonna continue talking about translation, then I just want to make one little additional note, which is that last year I read Oblomov for the first time by Boris. Let me check on that. So, Ivan Goncharov,
yes.
And it was incredible, and it blew my mind, especially because I hadn't heard much about it, so I hadn't like prioritized it in my reading of Russian literature, and then to just have this experience that was on par with anything I've read by Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and so on. Yeah, it blew my socks off, and I think a lot of that may be due to the translation. So,
And who was the translator?
I'd have to get up. I'll put that in the show notes. But either way, like, a good translation can go a long way. It's the theme of the...
Well, yeah, because I read it. I think I read Oblomov also a few years before you did, and I was less impressed. I mean, I'm glad I read it because it's sort of a Russian cultural touchstone,
right.
I think, or
it
I
is
understand.
for sure, and it's in the canon for high school students.
Okay, but I wasn't that impressed with the translation. I mean, I enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it, but I didn't think it was the best translation. So maybe I should give it another try with whatever translation you read.
Yeah, and like I said, I'll make sure we make a reference to that in the show notes. So, I'm going to start out really self-indulgently by asking myself a question, just in case you don't ask me this question. And as listeners may know, Mark and I alternate in choosing the text, and I chose this one. I live in Russia, as you know. I've lived here for several years, and I chose this text because I'm moving to St. Petersburg in August. That's one thing, and so Gogol is someone who, for me, is like firmly cemented in Petersburg. He has a collection of short stories called the St. Petersburg Tales, I believe. I think you may even have that. But anyway, I feel like Gogol, first of all, it's an easier text for us to tackle than a full-length novel. And then, furthermore, I'm going to call Gogol like the hipster's choice for the Russian writer. He doesn't have the epic quality of Tolstoy. He doesn't have the intense moral weight of Dostoevsky. But instead, he's kind of like the guy who's winking on the side. He's the satirist, obviously. And yeah, so I think that kind of playful aesthetic is something that I wanted to explore today. So my first question for you is, what general flavor or associations do you have just when I say Nikolai Gogol? I don't know which pronunciation I'm going to go with today, but yeah, but like without even necessarily referring to any text specifically, how do you view him and his work?
Well, I'm not actually as familiar with his work as I am with the work of other Russian authors. I think I've only read his stories, his most famously anthologized stories, The Overcoat, Diary of a Madman, The Nose,
yeah.
And so on. I've not read his novels, Dead Souls, Taras Bulba.
You haven't read Dead
Souls?
Souls? Oh my god.
I haven't, no.
Bro,
No,
that's like
I haven't.
essential reading. Essential.
Yeah, well.
That's like top 5 Russian books, in my opinion. I mean, that's
Okay.
right up there.
Well,
yeah.
It's on the list, but so many books, so little time.
Sure.
But to answer the question, in my with my limited capacity, the word grotesque comes to mind, and that's maybe it's because I recently read that Nabokov essay on Gogol, and he uses the same word. He describes the Overcoat as a grotesque and grim nightmare making black holes in the dim pattern of life, which I think is a nice description. But it's a kind of grotesque realism, and it's highly there's an attention to detailed description, but it's often to no purpose, and it's almost like there are elements of the absurd, similar to what we sometimes find in Kafka. And there are, I think you, in your preparation, noted some similarities with Kafka as well.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit later, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, I was just going to say you had contrasted Gogol with other Russian writers. And by the way, according to Nabokov, it's Gogol, not Gogol. He's trying to educate his American audience, I presume. But
Right, right.
anyway, he contrasts Gogol
Gogol.
with Gogol.
Gogol. Okay, I'll stop.
Gogol,
Thank you.
not Gogol.
Yeah. Like
Do we
Chagall.
sound animated enough? But he's being contrasted with what he calls steady Pushkin, matter-of-fact Tolstoy, restrained Chekhov, and somewhat surprisingly, he seems to consider Gogol to be, a superior artist, like superior to all of them.
Mm.
And I know that Nabokov was no big Dostoevsky fan. I think he rather despised him. But
And that's a reflection of
where
his
you would
own.
take that.
Well, that's a reflection of kind of his own preference, right? I mean, if we look at Nabokov's work, I would say it probably most closely resembles Gogol of the ones that we've mentioned. I mean, he definitely doesn't have that kind of imposing bard quality of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. So
not an epic quality, more of a satirist.
right. So it's no
Well-
wonder that that's kind of where he sees top quality.
We probably shouldn't be spending so much time on Nabokov, but he is, I mean, given our limitations and our relative ignorance of the Russian language, certainly you know more about it than I do, but
Spasiba.
yeah, well, come on, of course you do.
Yeah, no. That's why I'm saying yes, I do. Spasiba. Give me my laudits.
Yes, okay. Well, but as English speakers, we are reliant on these translators, and Nabokov, whatever we may think of him, and he's not my favorite author in English. I've read several of his works, but I've enjoyed them to varying degrees, but he's a very important interpreter of Russian literature to the English-speaking world, I think, and particularly to America, which is where he lived and taught and so on. And he translated numerous Russian works. I've read some of his translations, so I look to him for. I'm always curious to hear his opinion about Russian literature in particular, even if I don't necessarily agree with him.
Great. So we know that Nabokov loves the story that we're discussing today, and he's actually called it the greatest Russian short story ever. The French diplomat and travel critic Eugene Melchior de Vogue said, "We all come out from Gogol's Overcoat." And let me get your thoughts
Did you
on
know this
that.
before you picked it?
No.
Okay.
And in fact, I don't rate it to the same degree. I mean, I think that there are many short stories which I've enjoyed more. Which doesn't mean I'm not happy we're discussing it today, but it doesn't necessarily have that power over me. But what do you think? Is it deserving of being in a conversation for greatest Russian short story ever?
Well, of course, it you can make an argument for it. It's not. I don't know that it would be my personal favorite. Like since I mentioned Dostoevsky earlier, I wouldn't even rank it higher than The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. But that's just me.
Right. Well, what are the things about the story, before we kind of jump into more specifics, what are the things that stand out initially for you? What do you enjoy
Well,
about
like
it?
details. Oh, okay. Well, I mean, as I'm reading, I'm always looking for these parallels and these examples of intertextuality, and it reminds me. I mentioned Kafka before, who wrote about bureaucracies and offices, and I think it was. I tried to find this quote before the show, but I wasn't able to. I believe it was Kafka, but it may have been Pessoa. I want to say it was Kafka, and I may have seen this randomly when I was in Prague, but I believe it was Kafka who said something like, "The office is a magical," or maybe he said, "imaginary or fantastical world." And so just the fact that this story, this grotesque short story, is also set in a bureaucracy and an office is a very interesting parallel, because that's the most banal place imaginable in some.
But we know
ways.
Kafka was a big critic of bureaucracy, so is that quote meant sarcastically or what?
Well, but this was the world. Of course, he's a critic of it, and I would say that Gogol is too in the Overcoat.
Sure, of course. I mean, that's
certainly
obvious. It's obvious. But I'm saying,
but aren't they doing the same things? They're satirizing the bureaucracy. Think of Kafka's.
No, they are absolutely. But I'm saying, isn't the quote you just read? Wasn't the quote saying the opposite?
Well, no.
Repeat the quote.
Okay, well, I don't have the quote,
no,
unfortunately, but it's something like
paraphrased.
The office is a magical world. In other words, it's a world of mystery and the fantastic. It's not what we think it is. He's not making a value judgment necessarily. He's saying it's not what it appears to be. In fact, it looks like a banal, mundane locale, but in fact it is a place of mystery, magic, fantasy, and
but what justification does he have for that? Is my point.
In Kafka's case, it's the site of horror and terror and confusion. Well, just read his works.
Sure, but my impression was that he condemns the office as more like a site of absolute mundaneness. That's why I'm confused, because the quote you read kind of makes it sound like such a colorful place.
Well, it is. It's not necessarily meant in a positive sense. It's just a place where mysterious, strange, surreal, inexplicable things happen.
Yeah.
It's not a realistic place. It's a surrealistic place. I mean, again, think of the trial. Like the shit that happens there is surreal, and it's in the bureaucratic offices of the court and the bureaucracy of that dystopian society.
Okay, yeah, I see that. So maybe in its artifice or in its repressive nature, it kind of brings out these elements. I guess you could make the argument, right? And the fact that it's yeah. So yeah, I mean, the main emotion for me, first of all, I think because you spoke to the grotesque earlier, it might be useful just to give a brief, less poetic definition than the one that Nabokov provides. So the one I've got here is something that simultaneously invokes a feeling of uncomfortable bizarreness as well as sympathetic pity. So I think that's like an interesting contrast.
Very apt, yes.
And so, yeah, I think that stories like this, and I think that many Russian stories have this kind of tragic tone to them. I think maybe they can't help but contain that when they speak to Russian poverty plus the cold. So you've got these two really challenging forces that exist in this society. And Yeah, so I think that's the thing. I guess the main thing that jumps out at me is just the depressive quality of the narrator's life, how difficult it is for him to replace this overcoat, how he just...
Well, he's not the narrator.
Sorry, yeah. Did I say the narrator? I just meant
The protagonist,
yeah, the
right?
protagonist. So, yeah, my bad. So just the protagonist's poverty, and despite actually not even being at the lowest rung of society. I mean, in fact, he exists in the 9th category of 14. So there were 14 positions in Russian society at that time.
So just imagine how shitty it is down at the 14th level.
Exactly. I mean, he basically has to starve himself and go without candles to save up enough money for an overcoat. So,
but at the same time that there's this pitiable, sympathetic quality, he's also, I mean, we also, well, I shouldn't say we, maybe you feel differently, but I also feel a kind of contempt for him, right? He's kind of ridiculous and I don't know, what's his name? Chekhov has a story called The Nincompoop, which is about a person who just allows herself to be trampled upon by her so-called superiors, right? Isn't he like that? And is it possible to both pity and despise?
yeah, I mean, once you mentioned that, I think that's like a really valid reading. Maybe because I have a natural reaction just to pity people, including myself. It's like my first reaction to life. I think maybe, yeah, my primary emotion was just pity and sympathy, because he didn't really do too much that was contemptible. But you're right. I mean, at some point, passivity isn't necessarily a noble quality, and so yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Well, I think one of his best moments, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's heroic, but I wanted to cheer for him when, just before he died, he expressed a kind of rebellion, you know? I can't remember exactly what he says. But
well, he stands up, he demands to see this important personage, and that's the first time that he's kind of really tried to assert himself, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Before when he had to speak to someone above him in the social hierarchy, he would hem and haw and act like a buffoon, you know. But yes, so he's so concerned about the overcoat that he demands a kind of justice by going to this important personage. But even after he's rebuffed there, I'm thinking of the moment just before he dies. He's screaming in a kind of delirium about his overcoat, right? Give me back my overcoat, or I don't remember exactly what he says.
Okay, yeah. For me, the last words is when he starts talking nonsense in his, like, actually illness, right? And so
Yeah.
Okay.
In a kind of delirium, yeah.
Right.
But it's
Yeah.
like
So I see what you're saying. That's when the repression manages to come out, right? In that dreamlike
it's like
state.
It's like he went down swinging in a way. He kind of woke up in a. I mean, it's still a pathetic victory in a way, but he shows signs of life. You know, it's like he becomes less passive and accepting of his abuse.
Right.
But there are a couple of other interesting parallels that this protagonist reminds me of.
Okay.
One is, of course, and I think you mentioned this in your notes that you sent me before we started recording, but Bartleby the Scrivener, right? Melville's Bartleby, and it's even the same job. Here again, we're in an office of bureaucracy, and this guy who, you know, prefers not to involve himself with humanity, loses himself in his work and just copies documents, much as the protagonist of the Overcoat does. He even takes documents home and does copying in his free time, in his spare time.
I will say, though,
so
that... Go on.
Yeah. Well, as I read this, I'm thinking, is this an allegory of the writer? You know, they're both, like... I think many people agree that in Melville's story, that is the case. The scrivener, the scribe, the copyist is, in a way, a writer. Like to be a writer like Melville, you have to isolate yourself and devote yourself to your craft. And so is Gogol also making a comment on the writer's life and the absurdity of that with this protagonist of the Overcoat?
I mean, things that would be problematic with that is like the way that he responds to his first suggestion that he be creative, right? And so he kind of gets that assignment where all he has to do is change it from the second person to third person into like the letter form, and he can't handle it. So I don't know that is like, I think it's an interesting analogy to, or an interesting parallel to make, but...
Well, I'm thinking of William S. Burroughs' comment that a writer is essentially a rewriter.
Yeah.
There's nothing new under the sun, right? Like when we compose a new text, we may think it's original, but really we're writing or we're creating a palimpsest, to use a pretentious literary term, right? Like we're writing over some other text which is beneath it, and which has influenced us subconsciously. We're rewriting. When we write, we are rewriting.
I hear that, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. Let me come back to the Bartleby thing for a second, because what I thought was interesting about this Wikipedia entry, and I hate to to admit my very basic source here, but that's okay. Says they're actually, in many ways, complete opposites, because Akaki has like a lustful passion for this mundane copying, whereas Bartleby begins rejecting his work, saying, "I would prefer not to," and eventually just completely refuses this this nature of work, right? So yeah, so we have one lover of the simplicity, the mindlessness of office work, and someone who responds in a way that I think we'd be more sympathetic to, which is like, enough of this bullshit, right? So I think, yeah, I mean, what do you think of the joy that this very basic work seems to give Akaki? I mean, even, you know, how he'll just sit there and he has his favorite letters even, and he sits there and admires them, and it's kind of very childlike, right? It's almost like, I hate to say it, but like someone who, yeah, is mentally challenged.
Well, he very well may be. I mean, I remember, I think I highlighted a passage talking about how it wasn't the style of the document that interested him when he was copying it, but he was more impressed by the social importance of the person mentioned, or the person who wrote it, or whatever. Right. So again, he's caught up in that hierarchy.
Yeah, speaking of that, there's a nice quote I pulled out from the text also. It says, "That's the way things are in Holy Russia. Everyone tries to ape his superior." Oh,
yes, I remember that. That's a great line.
And yeah, this is obviously about...
Today?
I was thinking about that, and I think it is. Like, again, I always feel slightly paranoid when I bring the personal in, because I think about our delightful audience. But yeah, my friend Vika, she works at the school where I work, and she still refers to her boss like by the first and second name, you know. So she'll say like, maybe I could just change the names later, but say like she's Anna Akanomich or something, right? And this is someone, yeah, slightly older than her, but to use the first and surname when it's a fairly small company and they spend a lot of time together, many times in like social settings, but she still wants to keep that level of formality in the way that she addresses her. And I also, in my current job, yeah, I feel like there's a lot of deference paid to authority, to uncomfortable degrees sometimes.
Well, that goes on in the West too.
Oh, and in Korea, right? We know that.
Well, and
you're not supposed to go home
Tai-
until the boss goes home.
And in Taiwan, where I am, I mean, I'd say to some degree that's a universal phenomenon. I mean, that's why we can relate to the Overcoat, right? Like we've seen it.
Right.
But I've got another parallel for you.
Okay,
which
go on.
I don't think your notes mentioned.
Okay.
The Legend of Sleepy Hollow.
I classify this like a Rumpelstiltskin type text. Is that right? Is it like?
It's Washington Irving.
I think that's the same writer.
Well,
could be wrong.
Well, you may be thinking of Rip Van Winkle.
Possibly, yeah. Possibly.
But they're both ghost stories in a way, and I think the protagonist of the Overcoat has his analog in the Ichabod Crane character. And here again we have a kind of buffoonish Ichabod Crane is the local schoolmaster, right? He's not, I don't know, it's been a while since I read it. I don't know that he's specifically mentioned as a writer, but he's kind of like this little community's idea of a learned man, you know. But of course he's a total buffoon, and he is bested and terrorized by a kind of bully similar to the person or persons that steal the overcoat from the protagonist in Gogol's story. So again, we have a kind of character who represents the poverty of learning and possibly literature, and that character being
what do you mean exactly by poverty of literature?
Poverty of learning. Like,
but so you mean like
he's a feckless buffoon,
right? Right. Okay.
And so I mean, maybe it's different from Bartleby, who at least stands up for himself. But this Ichabod Crane character is, I mean, he's ridiculous. He's a clown, and the tough guy completely mocks and ridicules him and gets the better of him. And so something similar happens in the Overcoat. I just wonder if because The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was published in 1819, 1820, and the Overcoat came out in 1842. I wonder if Gogol had, was he familiar with it at all? I think some Western and even American literature was probably available in Russia at that time.
Right. The final allusion I want to throw out is, or the final parallel, is the character of Milton from Office Space. Are you familiar with that movie?
Oh, yes, I am. He's the guy with glasses and the weird
that
hair.
they keep moving, and they keep and then he keeps demanding his stapler.
Oh yes.
So, yeah, it's Another
What's
kind of
the
pathetic office.
What's the manager's name? Lumberg.
Yeah, Lumberg. It's a great role.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with you there.
Exactly.
Oh, it's been a while since I saw that. Yeah, Milton. Okay, I know exactly whom you mean. Yeah, this is if we were casting the Overcoat, if we were filming the Overcoat and we were setting it in an American office, he would be well cast in that role, whoever that actor is.
I wonder if his overcoat hadn't been stolen, do you think that there was the potential for some kind of social, what do you call it, like some kind of social climbing from Akaki? I mean, we're noticing his character change, right? Like especially has that, he almost pursues a woman for a second. He has these weird emotions looking at this picture of like a French woman, right, in the window.
Yes.
So,
well, there's something erotic about it.
Yeah, that's like clearly hasn't been a part of his character until now, and so.
Yeah. Well, he's got a burst of confidence in a way.
Right.
But I wonder, okay, he goes to that party. Are they just fucking with him? It seems like they really do admire the Overcoat, but is it all just a put on? Or are they just like, secretly mocking him to see how he will react?
Well, it definitely seems like he's still a long way from being included in the group, right? I mean, he still leaves without even saying goodbye. He just sneaks out.
And what happens when he does? He finds that his overcoat is on the floor.
Right.
So was that intentional? I mean, or was it just such a raucous party, everyone's drunk, that someone left and didn't notice that they had knocked it off the coat rack or whatever? Or
I mean, it's significant for sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting detail.
I think with his character, what happens as far as his overcoat getting stolen is pretty inevitable, right? I mean, he wasn't going to be able to maintain this like slight bit of momentum that life has given him. I don't think, he just doesn't have that gene, that assertive gene. Although who knows? But I think we are cheering for him though, right? Like we want him to improve his lot, but maybe that is something that we can criticize as well, because what makes him a redeemable character in a way, at least to himself, is just how happy he is. He's even happy when he starts depriving himself of food and candlelight, right? I mean,
well, this is the great adventure of his life, like having this overcoat made by the tailor who lives,
okay.
What is it, upstairs or next door? It's like it becomes a passion. It's like the focus of all his waking hours and probably his dreams too. And as you say, he's basically starving himself. He's got to figure out how to budget it. It's like, he's dealing with the issues I deal with when I start a new project, whether it's a book or an album or whatever,
or a podcast,
or a podcast. Which, well, the budget for this is not as significant as the budget for an album when I gotta like pay for studio time and pay musicians and so on. But it's a real passion project for him, and so I feel like I am cheering for him, rooting for him, and But
isn't it really a curse though? I mean, he was so contented prior.
Was he though?
It seems so, yeah. It seems so.
If he really was, then why did he become so interested in having the overcoat made? Was he just deceived?
Well, first of all, he didn't have any choice, right? He
didn't
absolutely
have to
tried
be-
to salvage the dressing gown.
True. Yes, but he didn't have to. He didn't have to become so emotionally invested in it.
That's true. Yeah. I want to discuss this Marxist reading, but maybe we could. I don't know. We can either jump into it now.
Yeah, do it.
Okay. Well, first, I wanted to pick out a section of the Nabokov, which I both enjoyed and felt was very pretentious. And maybe both things can exist, and maybe both are valid readings.
Sure, they can.
So I'm just going to read it. So Nabokov delineates between different types of readers and their respective responses to the story. So he says, the superficial reader of that story will merely see it in the heavy frolics of an extravagant buffoon. The solemn reader will take for granted that Gogol's prime intention was to denounce the horrors of Russian bureaucracy. But neither the person who wants a good laugh, nor the person who craves for books that make one think, will understand what the Overcoat is really about. Give me the creative reader. This is a tale for him.
I like that. I want to be a creative reader.
I do, but I don't like the way that he... And I think at one other point he says something to the extent of... a second-rate reader looks for texts that are almost like a friend is writing it, right? Like you're having a relationship that you can relate to, and the writer is someone who could be like your buddy, your chum. And he said, but that's like a shit writer in a way. Like the top writers are so eccentric that they can't even be on your level as the reader. I just felt like I just disagreed with that. First of all, because my favorite text, is Catcher in the Rye, which and Salinger makes a big deal of saying the opposite, where Holden says the best type of writer is the kind of guy that you want to just call up. And I always liked that because I feel like for me, one of the main functions of art is provide you with a type of friendship, even if it's one-sided friendship.
Because such a writer is not phony. Is that the word he uses?
Yeah, phony, for sure, it's phony.
Yeah, phony.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
I mean, beyond that,
we don't
that's
have to-
one aspect.
We don't have to. Yeah, well, we don't have to buy into Nabokov's hierarchy, but I just like the term creative reader.
Me too.
We can, the text is a kind of mirror, and we can. Well, for one thing, we can see ourselves in it, but also it's kind of a Rorschach test, right, where we see what we want to see.
Right.
Which would also make it a kind of mirror now that I think about it, I guess. But I'm presuming you're mentioning this first because he would probably argue that this Marxist interpretation is an example of the solemn reader, right?
Exactly. Something that's reductive.
Who's looking for something that'll make one think or whatever.
Or is seeing as from the lens of moralism, and he seems really keen to extricate it from that type of reading. He wants to say that this world that Gogol has created is a different world, and it's his world, that so we can't apply our standard realistic interpretation, which would include a Marxist reading.
Well, why is it either or? Can't it be both and? I mean, can't we look at it on multiple levels? To me, that makes the text more... the more intricate it is and the more layers there are, the more fascinating it is, right? You can look at it from that moral perspective, but you can also say, okay, at the same time, it's kind of a fantastic nightmare world. Why can't it be all?
Of course, and I think that's right, and I think it should be, and so
yeah.
So, but are you brave enough to tell me that what the Overcoat is really about then? For assuming that you continue that Nabokov line of thinking.
it's all of these things. It's all of these things. It's a critique and a satire of the hierarchical Russian society of the day.
Yeah, but
It's,
not according to Nabokov. So I'm saying, what would you say?
Oh,
Like,
well, then I don't need his approval.
I know, but I'm just curious if you have
Yeah.
like another reading that like is not one that
This
we've
is
mentioned.
what I would say.
Okay,
it's
go on.
all
Sorry.
of these things. It's all of these things. It is a critique and satire of the social hierarchy of that day in Russia. It's at the same time, character study, or if we can even use the term a caricature study, because he's kind of cartoonish, this protagonist. It's also just an entertaining tale, and it does have these fantastic grotesque, nightmarish qualities too. And I still think it's a kind of allegory of the writer or the writerly life, on some level. So I don't have to pick and choose.
Sure. But I guess I'm curious in going deeper into that like higher consciousness, let's call it, interpretation. I'm going to read another passage just from a little bit further on, and I think you actually read the first sentence earlier on in the show. So the first sentence starts with the one that you read. The gaps and black holes in the texture of Gogol's style imply flaws in the texture of life itself. Something is very wrong, and all men are mild lunatics engaged in pursuits that seem to them very important, while an absurdly logical force keeps them at their futile jobs. This is the real message of the story. In this world of utter futility, of futile humility and futile domination, the highest degree that passion, desire, creative urge can attain is a new cloak, which both tailors and customers adore on their knees. So I like that section. But I think the ironic thing...
I love most of that. The only thing I object to is, the real message of the story is. I mean, that's pretty reductive. But I think it, it's like a forerunner of Kafka and the surrealists, and in a way it's very 20th century, even though it's 19th century. Like I agree, you don't, like with the other Russian authors that we love so much, there's much more of an allegiance to a kind of realism,
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah.
but here we've got something different.
Right.
There are elements of the fantastical and the surreal, we could even say, although that wasn't, at that time there was no such concept, it hadn't been articulated yet, but it's there, it's implicit. And
I guess maybe the only thing that existed was something like a ghost story, right? Which this is kind of like a twist on.
Yeah, right.
But just something funny I noticed, like, as I'm trying to say, like, here's this new world, this Gogol world, but actually, if I focus on that sentence that I just read, it actually does lend itself to a Marxist reading. Because if it says about this new cloak which both tailors and customers adore on their knees, well, that is like a segue to this Marxist reading, which talks about what's this new expression that I found, which I like, this sexy expression, commodity fetishism. Right? So in a way, like, we can come back to that.
That's very valid.
And so what do you think about commodity fetishism?
I like that in relation to this notion that, the character might be an allegory of the writer. On some level, what we think of as our passion projects and our artistic endeavors, our creative efforts, right? Since we're all trapped in the capitalist nightmare. Maybe that's just another form of commodity fetishism as well.
The product of writing.
Yes, or whatever, making a podcast or making music or painting a picture.
Okay,
whatever,
I would say, like, I think that's a bit... I prefer the reading which is more a straight criticism of capitalism in terms of, like, us taking our value from material things, where I would say, like, the creative process is something that is absolutely redeeming.
Well, I accept that too, but I'm just trying to be a creative
Sure,
reader.
and I like that. I'm just saying,
And
but...
I'm trying to express excitement.
Okay. So commodity fetishism, though, like, it's clearly still, like, a massive issue in our world, right? I mean...
Yes.
Yeah, so, and...
Yeah, and that, you know, that might add to the surrealistic, nightmarish quality of it, because at the end of the day, this is something so trivial. It's a fucking overcoat, you know?
Right.
Like, what's the line from Alexander Pope? From I can't remember it, but you know, it's from The Rape of the Lock, I think. You know, We'll have to put it in the show notes.
Okay.
But from Trivial Matters, The Rape of the Lock being a mock epic, right? And we were talking about the epic quality of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and so on. Maybe Gogol is a mock epic poet or writer, but the Pope line is something about from trivial matters great things come, or something of that sort. Obviously, that's not the.
But is he saying it more in a positive way? Like,
no, it's completely. You mean Pope?
Yeah.
No, it's completely. It's a mock epic. It's a complete, like, the idea. The Rape of the Lock is about a young gentleman that takes a lock of hair from a young lady in, you know, polite society. Ridiculous, right? But he wrote a whole poem about it in the mock epic style, because it's such a stupid, trivial event, and he's presenting it on the heroic scale. You know, this is not like the Trojan War,
right.
But you can make anything if stylistically you choose to present it that way. You could make the most banal and ridiculous events seem to be of cosmic significance. So yeah, like, it's absurd, because all of this is much ado about nothing. You know, it's just a tattered overcoat that's basically a, what do they say? Not a bathrobe, but a
dressing gown.
Dressing gown.
Yeah.
Dressing gown, and it's replaced by a new one with a marten collar. It's made out of a marten, which is like a weasel.
Ermine.
Yeah, I mean, it's silly, and then
and that's why that's why you could say, like, socialists would love this text, you know, because and I mean, I just want to, like, add this image just in a video that I was watching, which was, it's like a progressive podcast between a Marxist and a progressive. That's, like, how it's referred to, and they just referred to, like, people's obsession with sneakers. That typing is loud. Or the iPhone, but I think the sneakers, especially at my school, like, it's crazy, you know? I mean, the amount of money people will spend on sneakers, and the kind of, the religion around sneakers is scary, and brands. And I know that I was guilty of that. I was guilty of, like, worshiping brands in high school, so
what was your brand?
You wouldn't be able to guess, probably, because it was like, I was like a hip hop kid, right? So Sean John, it was Puff Daddy's label. I don't know if you heard of it. Okay, yeah. So Sean John, also Fat Farm, but, like, Sean John had this, like, classy quality to it, and it was expensive. Like I would spend like $25 on like a wife beater, but I'd be like so happy with that little insignia that said Sean John.
You're such a wannabe.
And the funny thing is, my dad always made fun of me, right? And it's one of those things where like dad was right, and he always wore like plain t-shirts, and I was always like, why would you wear a plain t-shirt? It like seemed so kind of like basic. And now like I love just plain. Like if I see something with like a brand name, I intentionally don't want to buy that, because it just seems so so cheap.
Does that apply to shoes too? I mentioned shoes because MacAndrew translates the protagonist's name as Shukin, which is from the Bashmachkin of the original Russian, right?
Right,
Probably
right.
didn't pronounce it right, but it means shoe, right?
Right.
Like it's Mr. Shoe in a way. So do you have a brand loyalty when it comes to shoes? Because
somewhat, yeah. I'm still a sucker for. I think shoes definitely still have a monopoly on people post their teenage years, And the funny thing is now, the funny thing is just the way that shoes work in Russia now that Nike is left and Adidas and stuff. I mean, you have a huge black market of like fake Nikes, fake Adidas, but like the quality is pretty good and they're not exactly cheap. So like I would say 75% of the shoes I bought in Russia have been like fake knockoffs, but they're still like at least like $50 or $60.
Yeah.
But it's just it's funny how even buying that fake, I still want to have that branding, right? Like I still want it to seem like I've got.
Oh man, that is so petty.
One more funny little anecdote. One funny anecdote. I bought these like these fake Kanye West Yeezys like years ago in Russia, and then I had them in England, and in England you don't have that same like black market, so people were pretty impressed because they assumed that I'd spent a shitload. In England, those were like going for
thought
like
they were real.
Yeah, and people were like, "Yo, where did you get those?" I've been saving up. This guy I met at like the equivalent of like 7-Eleven was like, "I've been saving up for a month like to get me some Yeezys." And then just the last part of the story, I went to this like kind of beach town with my school, and kind of like a trashy beach town, and British kids are pretty aggressive. Like that's what they're kind of known for. They can be pretty crude, especially like, I hate to say it, but like, more like a working class kid. And this group of like maybe 10, 11-year-olds circled me in this beach town and started yelling, "Those Yeezys are fake! Those Yeezys are fake!" And it's like I had been exposed and I like turned red and I was like upset. And it's just funny. Like I was getting mobbed and bullied by these like young children.
Wrong.
Yeah, but it was just such a weird emotional experience.
I mean, you're lucky that it wasn't late at night in a darkened area. They may have jumped you and stolen them, like those thugs took the Overcoat. Yeah,
I mean, I think getting harassed by young people can be even more threatening than people your age sometimes. Because there's like a menace to like ruffians.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of morals and just lack of fear.
Well, and lack of accountability. Like they could beat the shit out of you, and then.
Yeah. It reminds me of like Graham Greene. Have you read Graham Greene?
Well, which in particular?
I don't know, like Brighton Rock. He has like some pretty tough characters in that story, but I don't know. But yeah, I think yeah. Anyway, so that's my little anecdote about brands.
That's very apt. I'm just glad that you weren't attacked.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say that my brand loyalty now is to Asics shoes. I
always pronounce it Asics.
Yeah, well, that's fine.
I'm just saying, did you make up that pronunciation, or is that one that you've heard?
No. I mean, maybe it is Asics, but actually it's an acronym for a Latin phrase, but we won't go into that. But it's because they're the most comfortable.
Okay.
Before, I liked New Balance, but the soles were very slippery, and so it rains a lot here in Taiwan, and I was always slipping and almost busting my ass, so I had to switch to Asics, which are not as slippery, and they're also still comfortable.
We're gonna play a quiz game really fast, okay? So I'm gonna tell you. Yeah. Okay, go on.
I found the quote. From Alexander Pope.
Okay, go on.
What dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? I knew it was trivial something.
Can you read it one more time so I can like really hone in?
What dire offense from amorous causes springs? What mighty contests rise from trivial things? This is from The Rape of the Lock.
Okay.
The second line is more relevant to our story here. But what mighty contests rise from trivial things? In other words, like, you know, the epic, the trivial can become the epic.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, in a way, what we're dealing with in the Overcoat.
Although it ends it does end in death. Yeah, so I mean that would be, I guess, the.
Yeah.
No, it's stupid. I was just gonna say.
Ridiculed.
Yeah, okay. So how do you think? Maybe you already know, but like, how would you guess Nike is pronounced in England?
Nike.
Yeah. Okay. And Adidas.
Adidas.
Yeah. So you already knew that, right?
Like the German. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It was just funny for me the first time when I heard the alternate pronunciation.
I've been corrected. There's an Irish writer here, and she corrected my pronunciation. I'm like, hey, it's from Beavertown, Oregon.
Right, exactly.
And in the States, we say Nike. Sorry.
And what about the goddess,
which
like
is also,
herself?
Which is
she was Nike,
wrong.
right?
Nike.
Ah, okay.
Nike.
Okay.
Nike. So we're all wrong. I'm sure those that rich family in Oregon that started the company, they probably didn't know how to pronounce the Greek either. So
fine. I'm gonna just say one more thing because I don't know. Like, I'm pretty charged up on coffee, and
that makes it more exciting. Keep going.
I'm gonna find a different. No, I'm gonna define a different piece of triggering commentary to feed at the start of each show, and we can watch how it.
That's good.
Produces fireworks. No, so I was just gonna say, like, I had another like moment of kind of sadness about staying in Russia the last couple of days, just from a couple of different sources who were describing life outside of Russia, and I was just kind of feeling rueful for staying. And yeah, I mean, I think a text like this, as much as it's a reflection of Russia, feels, sad in a way, because I do think that, leaving foreign policy aside, I think that, Russians have a difficult time of it. And the image of life that we've seen portrayed in the text, and especially in terms of the climate and the poverty, that stands out for me. Like, I can't help but that's the main reading that I'll take from this text, which is just like a regret that that people can't have a better standard of living, with more leisure time, but this is not the Mediterranean, unfortunately.
This is what?
This is not the Mediterranean, we just don't have that over here.
Yeah, but what besides the Mediterranean is the Mediterranean? Isn't that what life is like for most people throughout the world? Too much work, not enough leisure, too much concern with social climbing and deference to so-called superiors.
There's no doubt that there's a universal quality to that, like 100%. But Russia has a special intensity of dire, and I think that the climate is significant in that. And I mean, I don't know, and I hope that I want Russia to get back on a track where they're enjoying prosperity, and I feel like they've had that. It's for a certain stint of time especially at the start of Putin's reign, So anyway, let's not get too political. I don't have anything else to say. Do you want to add anything?
I want to share a random line which I like for some reason. Maybe you can explain why I like it.
Okay, please.
Or what's interesting about it. I mean, there are a lot of these random details that are very carefully described and then abandoned. It's just like a throwaway line, which is so funny. This is a reference to the important personage's kept woman, right? Karolina Ivanovna. It says, this lady friend was not a bit prettier or younger than his wife, but the world is full of such puzzling things, and it is not our business to judge them. And then he just carries on with the narrative. It's so I don't know how to describe that. I like that throwaway commentary,
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because that's one thing we haven't discussed yet, which is the kind of the personality of the narrator and the narrator as a character. He's got this line, which I found interesting. We did allude to earlier how Akaki sees this image in a shop window of a woman revealing her leg, and I guess it's a poster or something. And the narrator gives us different interpretations of what Akaki might have been thinking. We know that Akaki kind of grinned and kind of maybe said something under his breath even. But then the narrator says, maybe he didn't even think that. After all, one can't just creep into a man's soul and find out everything he's thinking. So
he's admitting he's not the omniscient narrator,
right.
Even though he is in a way,
Right.
That's that kind of, and then that's the end of the paragraph, and he moves on to something else. At least the way it's translated into English.
Yeah, there's like a very impish quality, right?
Yeah. Whoa, very much so. Yeah. He's the narrator is a jester.
Right. And I know you like that role from our time in Korea. I still remember going to Kyobo with you, and you kind of I think you bought a book or something on archetypes, and you specifically picked out that archetype, if I'm not mistaken. Do you remember that?
Oh, like the trickster?
Yeah, the trickster, exactly.
Trickster rules this world or something like that.
By the way, shout out to Gwanghamun, shout out to Kyobo. Say.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, he's a trickster. He's a jester. He's, as Joyce would say, Joko serious. Like, it's both. It's am I jesting or am I in earnest? Am I playing a game? Am I fucking with you, or do I really mean it?
Right.
Once again, an important theme in my soon-to-be released book, Earnest Games. Got to get that plug in.
For sure.
One final note. According to Nabokov, Gogol was born on April Fool's.
Okay.
Interesting. He doesn't say April Fool's, but he says April 1st. I don't know is that acknowledged in Russia?
Yeah, it is.
It is. April 1. So he was born on April Fool's Day.
I think it's the same date. I remember something like that happening, so I think it is, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, we hope you enjoyed that. Mark, have you made an amendment then to what our next episode is going to be about? Because I know initially it was going to be Pink Floyd, no?
Not Pink Floyd.
David Bowie, sorry.
Right. The next text on the list was David Bowie's Berlin Trilogy.
Right.
I'm now thinking that in light of recent events in the States, we should revisit Carl Sagan's brilliant essay on abortion. So I haven't decided yet, but I'm leaning towards the latter. And listeners, you will just have to tune in and see.
Okay. Nice.
Or hear, rather.
Either way, I think they'll be in for a treat. All right, we hope you enjoyed.
It's going to be exciting.
I'm sure this won't be the last time that we discuss Russian literature because of where I live and Mark and I's interest in the subject. So if you liked that, we'll come back to Russian lit at some later date.
Sounds good.
All right. Peace out, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Texting. Hey guys, so I grabbed one of my top students named Fyodor and thought we could have a quick chat about Gogol in general in Russia and how he's seen here. So, Fyodor, how familiar is the average person with Gogol?
I think everyone in Russia read some of Gogol's stories. I'm sure that Taras Bulba is the most popular and almost everyone knows it. Not because...
Sorry, what is Taras Bulba?
Taras Bulba, haven't you read it before?
No.
Whoa, this is a story that has kind of racist vibes because it tells us about times of Kazakhi. Do you know what?
Kazakhs?
Yeah, of Kazakhs and their war with Poland. And this is a really patriotic book, and that's why, like, I think it is the most popular. But
it's racist against Kazakhs.
No, it is for Kazakhs. It is against people they war with. Kazakhs are...
so it's racist towards Polish people.
Not Polish, but to some European nations. And that's why in Poland, for example, this is a not really respected story. But in Russia, it is super well beloved.
And you like it?
I like it because it has so beautiful vibe of nature of Kazakhs, and it just describes relationship between father and their sons. And there is a super famous phrase that all Russians know, I think.
Can you tell us what that is? You can tell us in Russian.
In
too.
Russian, it sounds like "Я тебя породил, я тебя убью." In English, it will be like "I have born you, I will kill you." It is when
like I have given birth to you.
Yes, I have given birth to you, and now I will kill you.
Okay.
It is because the main conflict of the book is that old father Taras and his two sons Astap and Andriy, they're going to the war. His sons just returned from studying in some city in Ukraine, and he wants to show them some Kazakh life, war, and all. And Andriy falls in love with one Polish girl, and not girl, but like, you understood me?
Yeah, young woman.
Yeah, young woman. And Taras, who suffers on war and all that stuff, he can't even imagine his son with a Polish woman, because this is just like to betray all them.
Okay.
And then his son Andriy, he says to his Polish woman that I will kill my father for you, I will kill my brother for you, and all that stuff. And then in the culmination of all the book, he rides from the castle with the Polish army, and he looks so cool, so great. He goes against his own relatives and his kin, but when he meets his father, he just falls.
Like freezes.
He freezes. And his father says, I have given birth to you, and now I'll kill you. And he shoots and he killed his son.
Wow, okay, dramatic.
That is the very dramatic. And this phrase every Russian know. Я тебя породил, я тебя убью.
Nice, thank you. How would you compare Gogol's like style or flavor or themes compared to other famous Russian writers like Dostoevsky or Tolstoy?
About Gogol, I really don't like that he uses big paragraphs in original Russian books. I see you have here on the paper not big paragraphs, they're separated. But in Russian books, the paragraph can be 2 pages or something like that. This is Gogol's style, and it is cool. I like his description.
But that makes it difficult to read, right?
Not difficult, but unusual to see that. but he describes things really. I like that. Also, the final pages of Dead Souls, I absolutely like them because of that vibe of speed, of Chichikov thinking about where he's from, and all the thing that every person has a chance. I like Gogol because of that, and that's why I like Dead Souls the most, because it says about that. And in second part, Chichikov would be arrested.
Which aspect of the Russian character do you think like Gogol is interested in, or Russian society?
I cannot really think of one, but he loves to speak about simple person like Akaki Akakevich or Christiane, I don't know how to say it.
Yeah, I know, like serfs.
Yes, serfs, kind of. But like in Dead Souls, he thinks globally about whole Russian character, and this is cool.
And does he like use humor more than other Russian writers, or not necessarily? Because I noticed in this story there's so much kind of sarcasm and like.
In this story there is much sarcasm. He has book with just hilarious stories, but usually he uses sarcasm or things like that, and this doesn't make the books harder to read, but they're usually not very funny. For example, in Dead Souls there were funny moments, like when Chichikov in the second part, Chichikov was so possessed with his thoughts of he would be rich and all that stuff, he just flew. And I remember it in Russian, it was Чичиков с легкостью почти военного человека соскочил с брички и поздоровался с генералом. That could be translated something like Chichikov was light almost as a young soldier jumped off his бричка.
That's like a carriage, right?
Yes,
Something
and saluted general. This is very funny. That Chichikov is not slim at all, but he was so fine and flying at that moment. That was funny.
Okay. And I guess, do you want to briefly tell us about the controversy related to the second part of Dead Souls? You mentioned that that's like quite a topic for...
Yes, that is quite a topic, because at the beginning of the year we had Dead Souls, now literary or...
In the curriculum, right?
Yeah. And we read it, but I have in my book the things that researchers found from the second part. Gogol destroyed it, he burned it, but researchers found and made it, put it together.
Mm-hmm.
It is with some gaps in it, but globally it is almost finished part. And I like it so much because it has some plot twist there. Chichikov gets arrested.
Okay.
And then he somehow changes his mind. He doesn't change it, but Gogol is saying there that after he got arrested, Chichikov did the same thing as he did. He just said to his kucher, I don't know how to say it in English, Silifan, go...
His cook or his servant?
His servant.
Yeah.
They made their carriage and they gone, but Gogol says that Chichikov's mind was now like destroyed house now that is not ready for rebuilding, but is destroyed. So there is a hope for Chichikov.
Okay, nice. Thank you very much.